Okay, good morning. This lesson has been developed and recorded, thank you Alex, especially for the brethren in the Napier Church of Christ who suffered the upheaval of the cyclone Gabriel, but also I want to dedicate the lesson to a good friend of mine, Gareth, who is struggling with a life-threatening illness right now. When we think about humanity, humans are kind of strange. We know we're made in the image of God, but on one hand we feel that we're so clever and capable, and that, as we used to say, the sky's the limit. I guess it's the moon and Mars is the limit now. But there are definitely times when that confidence and that security and stability can change very suddenly. And all of a sudden things come that are beyond our control. And our world literally turns upside down. And when I thought of that title for this lesson, I didn't realize that it was taking the words from someone who actually was on the front line, who says, once those two words, red zone, were said to me, I just went into a frenzy. My whole life is now totally upside down. Now we realize with our own experience and with our viewing through media that there are so many things that can turn our world upside down. Severe weather, obviously, when the routines of daily living become extremely difficult. Perhaps it's a broken relationship, a broken heart. That can turn our world upside down. Perhaps it's the loss of a loved one. Immense emotional stress can turn our world upside down. Losing a job or not having a job can be devastating for self-esteem. I remembered when I was in my 40s and then 50s, that happened twice to me, a quarter of a century ago, and I still remember the pain and I still feel the pain. Your world is turned upside down. Chronic illness can be debilitating and sometimes life-threatening. But whatever the cause, our world in an instant can be turned upside down. And it's kind of like vertigo. The normalcy of our world spins out of control. And we all of a sudden find ourselves very vulnerable, physically, mentally, emotionally. We become unstable and insecure. And initially, when these crises come, they are just frustrating. But very quickly, those can spiral downwards and become very frightening. The irony, I suppose, with Cyclone Gabriel is that in the middle of the month that most working families with children especially take their annual holidays to fit the school year, and they go about enjoying the beauty of God's own, and they anticipate that that recreational pleasure would be enhanced by lovely warm summer weather, and all of a sudden everything changes, and in the middle of February we experienced a cyclone. And the media said this is the most violent storm to hit New Zealand in the century, and I thought, well, this century's only 23 years old at the moment, but perhaps it meant within the last 100 years. It certainly is something that is beyond most of our experiences in New Zealand. So a weather event of this kind of magnitude, where 4 regions, especially Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne, they experience literally their world turning upside down. Now many of the conveniences that we enjoy each day and we presume to be available every day, every time, they just disappear. All of the basics, things like electric power, so convenient, gone. Communications, we use them constantly, down. Transportation thwarted, bridges disappear, roads wash away. The supply lines of essentials, things like food and water and gasoline, cut off. Now, weather for us, whether we be travelers or perhaps sports people or even fishermen or farmers, weather for us usually focuses upon, is it going to be sunny today or rainy? And we've all seen scenes similar to these, but they are normally elsewhere, not here in our beautiful corner of the world. And so we realize eventually that despite all of our technical advances, despite all of our medical advances, despite our dominance over the animal kingdom, our ability to provide for ourselves a comfortable, safe, and secure life economically and financially, a catastrophic event beyond our control can instantly make us feel helpless, hopeless, and very fragile. And all of our presumption, all of our self-sufficiency is washed away just like these bridges were. And I started to think of where God's word addresses these matters, and I was drawn immediately to Psalm 46. Now, the Psalms are amazing because whereas most of the Bible God is speaking to us, we have these songs composed where people are speaking to God and to God's people. So the Psalms are the songbook of God's people of old. And some of these Psalms simply praise God because he is worthy of praise. Some of them are written in desperation where the people are writing to petition his help. And others, they are lamenting loss. Or perhaps they're lifting up thanks to a kind, caring, and gracious God. But some of the Psalms focus on the ugly side of life. And so Psalm 46 is one of those. And this kind of psalm speaks powerfully to the weak, to those who are fearful, to those who are sad, those who are lonely, those who are vulnerable, those who are discouraged, and especially to those who are desperate. And as it considers that aspect of life, the song points them to a caring, loving God who is competent to bring them through the crisis, who is able to turn their world right side up. He is ready and able and willing to comfort, to protect, to rescue those who turn to him when their life becomes unbearably tough. Let's read the text. God is our refuge and strength. I better put you on the right page. There you go. Always ready to help in times of trouble. So we will not fear when earthquakes come and the mountains crumble into the sea. Let the oceans roar and foam. Let the mountains tremble as the waters surge. And then we have a contrast. A river brings joy to the city of our God, the sacred home of the Most High. God dwells in that city. It cannot be destroyed. From the very break of day, God will protect it. The nations are in chaos and their kingdoms crumble. God's voice thunders and the earth melts. The Lord of heaven's armies is here among us. The God of Israel is our fortress. So even in times of crisis, when you might feel lonely and frightened, God is there, and that is the point of this song. It's interesting because mountains, by their sheer size and their rocky composition, are regarded as strong and powerful. They symbolize stability, yet in this song, the mountains fall into the sea and the mountains themselves tremble. Now, the songwriter is not describing geology. The songwriter is not writing this song to describe meteorology, weather events. He's speaking about when the circumstances of life overwhelm us, when security and safety disappears. When our life turns upside down, we are reminded that the sovereign Lord who reigns over creation is there, in the middle of that event, offering us rescue and refuge. Martin Luther, such an interesting person in Germany, leader of the Reformation, was raised and trained as a Catholic to a very high degree. He had the doctor's degree in theology, and he taught at the university, and his own study of the biblical text led him to believe that the church of his day, the universal Catholic Church, needed to be reformed because of immorality within the leadership of the church, and especially because he felt they had some doctrinal errors. And so he suggests this, they turn that down immediately, and all of a sudden his life is in danger. And he said that when his world got tough, this was the psalm that he went to. Interesting. So the question, I guess, is what does this psalm tell us? Well, it speaks, I think, to those people whose world has turned upside down, because it speaks to the circumstances of life. It talks about God who is still near to us. And it gives us a natural response which is far better than it might have been. So when there are times of trouble, we need to remember that there is a place of refuge. There is safety and security offering calm. When life does change for the worse, there is a provider of strength. When our world shakes and trembles, there is an available helper. And so the psalmist concludes, we will not fear because of that truth. Now, as within the Old Testament, where the world was destroyed by a flood, when one righteous family was saved from the destructive power of the ocean, when God's people also were delivered from the powerful army of Pharaoh and passed safely through the Red Sea. So we see several times in the New Testament survival sea stories when desperation changed to deliverance. And I think this one described by Luke in Acts 27 about Paul is instructive and applicable. And again, this story wasn't written to those interested in maritime events. It wasn't written to describe this meteorological event. It contains principles directly relevant to us when the circumstances of life are beyond our control and we feel overwhelmed. Excuse me. Those times when in desperation we find ourselves in survival mode and we cry out for help, anyone who can rescue us, who can restore a sense of calm and can return us to a place of normality, because that is what we desire more than anything else. Let's look at the text. When a light wind began blowing from the south, there have been many times where we owned a little boat and others who own boats have taken us out in Tauranga. And when the weather is fine, like it is today, and there's a light wind, there's nothing more pleasant. But we see that because of those starting circumstances, the sailors thought they could make it. They pulled up anchor, sailed close to the shore of Crete, but the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a northeaster burst across the island and blew us out to sea. Everything changes instantly. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. And the point is, like the weather, the circumstances of life can change very quickly. And we can lose control and we can give up. But that's not the end of the story. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. The sailors bound ropes around the hull to the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. And so it goes from bad to worse. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. So it's reached that terrible moment when hope itself disappears. Luke says, no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives. That probably seemed ridiculous for them to hear that. Even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. So God via this angel says to Paul, it looks pretty bad, but you have an appointment and you will keep it. So here we have a group of individuals, and it's like any person facing death by drowning. They'll grasp at any means of deliverance, any means of salvation. So perhaps we have here the beginnings of hope amongst this crew on the boat. Paul continues, what's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. Here's the lifeline. So take courage, for I believe it will be just as he said. So Paul is saying we need to grab this lifeline. It's the only one that's going to get off it. but we will be shipwrecked on an island. They dropped a weighted anchor and found the water was 36 meters deep, but a little later they measured again and found it was only 27 meters deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore, so they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officers and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So remember, God is part of this crisis, according to Psalm 46. He's there in any time of trouble. And they are saying, don't go away from your source of help. So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You've been so worried you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." So here's the good news. He took some bread, gave thanks before them all, broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing cargo of wheat overboard. Morning came and the ship's crew saw a coast they did not recognize. But they did see a cove with a beach, so they decided to run the ship around on the beach. They cut the anchors loose, let them sink into the sea. At the same time, they untied the ropes that were holding the rudders. Next, they raised the sail at the front of the ship and let the wind carry the ship towards the beach. But it ran aground on a sandbank. The front of the ship stuck firmly in the sand, and the rear was being smashed by the force of the waves. Things are still pretty serious. And I think the point is here that when chaos reigns and calamity threatens, it's really imperative to be in the right place, the right end of the boat. But in our crises, it's the same. It's important to be in the right place. And the right place is on our knees before God, who is capable of calming any storm that might threaten us and our lives. The soldiers, obviously responsible for the prisoners on board, wanted to kill them to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. The others held onto planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to the shore. You see, whenever your world turns upside down and wherever you look as catastrophe and chaos beyond your control, it's important to look to the one who cares, to look to the one who rescues, to look to the one who restores calm to the fearful soul. I was thinking about 40 years ago, I was in Bible school and studying the Psalms, and the teacher said you need to choose one psalm and memorize it. So I used a bit of cunning and flicked through, and I found a short one. I thought that should be easy to memorize. And it was, but this particular psalm, the truths in it have stayed with me through many of the difficulties that I have faced in life. And so Psalm 21 says, "I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps your soul will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time and on and forevermore." And I know you're wondering why I'm reading that, because I did memorize it 40 years ago. It's nothing to do with age. I've changed translation. Well, that's my story anyway. So when these situations come upon us, of a literal storm or just the circumstances of life turned our world upside down, it's no good looking around us and fixating our attention on the chaos and the circumstances of life. And it's certainly no good looking within for a solution, because this is beyond our control. And this songwriter said, you need to look up. You need to change what you're focusing on, because our outlook determines our outcome. That's one thing that is clear from this. So what can we learn from this story about enduring the storms of life? Well, simply this: life is not all smooth sailing. Our circumstances can change very abruptly. We live in a fallen world. Things are not as idyllic as they were when we read the story in the Garden of Eden. And despite all of our modern mastery, some things are beyond our control. And I think the most important one is that life-threatening events are fearful. We cherish our life, we value our life, we enjoy living and being well and healthy. But we are still fragile. And the part that makes the whole story important is that God, when he is a part of the story, the consequences can change for the better. But when God is not a part of the picture, as the story says, all hope goes. It disappears. And as the story says, God is able and willing to enable us to escape safely and reach the shore. And I suppose that the bottom line is this: faith can displace fear. Now, faith is a precious resource. It's that thing whereby we grasp gratefully the gracious offer of salvation. But faith is more than that. It's a daily connection to the grace of God. And so whenever the circumstances of life are beyond our control, for the child of God, the story ends right side up. And that's the good news. But notice how the psalm ends that we looked at first, 46. Be still and know that I am God. Verse 10. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. So, whenever you cannot still the storms of your life, still yourself. Refocus your attention and restore your soul. Be still and know that I am God. And so we need to allow faith to displace fear in our hearts. Because ultimately, it is faith in God that will ensure a future with him after this life ends. And if the crisis of life does bring the end of our life, there is something beyond. And the book that we call the New Testament ends by saying the end of the story is a place where there is no tears, there is no crying, there's no pain, no death, no mourning. And that promise, that assurance can carry us through any and every crisis when it does feel that our world is upside down. The sermon is yours, and I have provided 3 more slides and discussion questions to follow, where you'll be looking at another sea survivor story. So thank you for your attention. God bless you as you cope with these crises of life.